Sandrine, Dixson-Declève, welcome to the forum. You've just been on stage in a really interesting panel and discussion, so I'm going to ask you for what you heard, what resonated. But you are the Global Ambassador for the Club of Rome, a not-for-profit problem-solving organisation, and the Executive Chair of Earth for All, amongst several other roles. You talk about spending your time facilitating difficult conversations. I hope it wasn't a difficult conversation at the forum today, but of course Club of Rome talks about looking at feeding the world, certainly in its Limits to Growth report that's very famous from a long time ago, but focusing on problems that are problematic. I think today we can absolutely say the problems, they're problematic, it's big, right? Why was it important for you to speak at the forum today?
Well, I think there are a variety of reasons why I wanted to join the forum, and I was very honored to be asked by Janusz Potocznik, who's actually one of my co-founders of the Systems Transformation Hub. And that is because food has always been part of what we call the human problematique at the Club of Rome. When I took over as president of the club, as one of the first female presidents, actually, of the club 10 years ago, and had a mandate of 6 years, we decided that we wanted to commemorate the Club of Rome seminal report of the Limits to Growth by rethinking the complexity of where we were in the 21st century. And as we put forward our system dynamic model, we landed on 5 key turnarounds. And food transformation was one of those key turnarounds, around energy as well. And if we look at where we are today, it's exactly where we are in that conflict between our energy system, which must transform in order to be more resilient to future shocks and stresses and the current shocks and stresses, as well as our food system. And I think what's important as well is when we see that those people that are most impacted by both the energy and the food systems, it comes back to the most vulnerable, to those that actually are the poorest of our society, because either energy or food becomes unaffordable or even unattainable in some parts of the world, for example, in Africa.
What really resonated with you on stage today, because you were on a panel talking about the title, The End of the World as We Know It, and the consequences for agriculture and the environment?
So as I said, actually, on the stage, this is, for me, not the end of the world as we know it, because we've known for a long time that we were going to hit pressure points. And in fact, as an advisor to the European Commission, also working with former Commissioner Janusz Potocznik, who is chairing the forum, we've been giving suggestions to the European institutions on how we could be more systemic in our approach towards agriculture, towards land use, and also towards our energy system. And how we can both diversify and shift towards more sustainable practices, but also bring people on the journey. And I think one of the things that was a bit missing, actually, from our conversation was the citizen. We get caught up in the politics of food policy, but we don't actually start talking about citizens. I sit on the board of a new global assembly that actually took as one of its first key questions, how does food support your life and your livelihood? I think they went through about, I don't know how many testimonials. They brought together actually assembly leaders and citizens from across the globe, so more than the G20. Very interesting how most of these statistics that came back and the feedback on key questions around food and agriculture was one that people feel that this is a fundamental right for humanity, that affordable and green or nutritious food is absolutely necessary. But secondly, that one of the key solutions is localization. And I think finding that balance of how we look at greater local production, and by the way, here in Europe, also when we look at the AMOC and the new meridional shifts that we're going to see, which are going to have a huge impact within our ocean currents on the way in which we have much more severe winters because of climate change, we need to start thinking through what do we actually produce locally, how can it be regenerative, and how do we work with Africa? How do we work with our biggest suppliers in order to enable them to be able to produce locally, but also to continue to enter into partnerships where they can actually also continue to export food to Europe?
one of the themes here is always the urgency to action, to see outcomes for these big themes that we talk about. How worried should we be with the world that we have at the moment? It's planting season at the moment, but there's no diesel for the tractors, or at least it's unaffordable. There's no fertilizer for the field. Is there anything that policymakers can do now? Because policy is slow, but fast action is needed now, and that was one of the things that I know that you were all discussing at the forum today.
What I find so frustrating is, again, these suggestions that we gave at the beginning of the Ukrainian invasion, where we already saw an energy spike in terms of the costs, same thing in terms of fertilizer, and also problems with our value chain with regard to minerals. We said at that time, we need to put in place support structures for people. We need to ensure that we actually diversify fast. Well, what happened? We haven't done any of that. And so now we find ourselves in a crisis. We didn't have to be in a crisis. Okay, so what do we do now? I'm not saying that we just sit there and blame all the policy leaders, but what we do need is to make sure that the crunch is not felt predominantly by people, by citizens that are already hurting. We need to figure out ways in which we can either give them short-term loans in terms of the tractors and in terms of the rural communities. How can we support our farmers at this time? We need to keep the price at a certain level so that it doesn't go too high. But that means that we also need to tax the windfall profits of the oil and gas companies, which are about 2.8 billion per day, which are not taxed, or the 7 trillion in subsidies that are still given to fossil energy. We keep on hurting those actually that have the least, rather than taxing those that have the most. And I think it's time that we truly do that. We're now moving into Colombia, post-Belém, with the Santa Marta Conference, which is going to talk about a fossil fuel phase-out. And we must actually come to a plan where we think about phasing out fossil fuel, but in the meantime, where we enable people to continue to transition, to be brought on a journey that makes sense. Setting up just transition funds, even a while back, I proposed to the European Commission to issue European bonds or European checks. If Donald Trump, by the way, as a dual American-Belgian citizen, received a Trump check as well as a Biden check post-COVID, the Trump check was a lump sum of $1,000+ for every single citizen. Now that came out of the Treasury. At this time, when we also see, by the way, anti-Europeanism growing, populism growing, the best thing we could do is start to make Europeans proud to be European and say, we see you, we understand you, working with member states to issue either a bond or a check or something to support every single citizen that's going through this difficult time.
Sandrine, thank you so much. I think you talked about planet prosperity and people being at the heart of everything that you strive to do. Thank you so much for sharing it with us today, and enjoy the rest of the forum.
Thank you.